For the uninitiated, Devilman is a Japanese manga written and illustrated by the insanely prolific Go Nagai, whose work just recently received a Netflix animated adaptation of the titular manga, titled Devil May Cry Baby. But today, I want to discuss my introduction to Devilman, and recommend it to those who are interested in understanding what this series is. Now, I know Hyperbit Hero recently released a video about Devilman, so shush, this is my take on it while it's still hot off the presses. I have to start off with discussing the creator's impact on the landscape of manga, with introducing some of his work. He has managed to break many taboos, and was the first manga artist to depict someone piloting a mech, which is now a common mainstay, and even is its own subgenre to this day. He also created Honey Honey, which was considered one of the first magical girl manga and a huge influence on the genre, a la Sailor Moon, developing haunting horror action pieces, which showcase mutilated gore and nudity to the extreme, while discussing nuclear proliferation and casual blasphemy. Now, let's take a step back to his past and get a quick summary of what led to Devilman. Starting off with Shameless School, it was an erotic manga that became a huge success and helped initiate a cultural shift in Japan in the late 1960s. Although, despite the eventual success, Nagai was nervous about having to create a long-running series in what would be one of Shonen Jump's first published manga. Shonen Jump would go on to become the home of worldwide phenomenons like Dragon Ball Z and One Piece. Even with a hit under his belt, it caught wind of the PTA and detractors worldwide, who would, for example, lobby protest as soon as he'd get outside of the plane if he flew outside of Tokyo. He was ridiculed as well publicly, branded a nuisance and an enemy of society, although he remained pretty unfazed by those claims. Later, in 1969, he would go to found Dynamic Productions with his brothers, and that became a company to protect his contractual rights to his work, which before, he wasn't receiving any royalties from the other adaptations of his creations. So, pretty good business move on his part. After Shameless School's success and others, he was mostly writing gag comedies with variances, which left editors typecasting his abilities, although this changed with the one-shot story Oni, which depicts the Onis treated as a lower class that are at war against the humans. Then, in 1971, he would go on to create some more horror-themed one-shots, before eventually settling on his most famous horror story, Fight Fire with Fire, a common phrase around since the time of Shakespeare, fueling the ideology of the protagonist's plight in Devilman. Akira Fudo, our faint-hearted hero, thanks to his sociopathic childhood friend Ryo, he ends up ensnared in a battle against the underworld himself, and the only way he can fight back is by becoming the so-called Devil Man, utilizing the worst of himself and resisting the violent urges in order to protect those he cares about, as well as intentionally using those violent urges to butcher his villains in question. At first, seemingly, given the nature and time period of the manga, you'd question its ability to have a meaningful message or commentary, but it manages to discuss the socio-political fears of the world at that time. There are talks of characters discussing and portraying racial bias, nuclear global destruction, along with being so casual about its blasphemous use of demons and God's smiting power. It's eerie and tantalizing, which by now I've been sharing panels and art from the work, which highlights not only its extreme violence, but also its art style. The depictions of the characters use these wispy lines to simulate movement and almost smothering darkness. This is also a little evident of the era. The sketches are overly more masculine in comparison to what comes later in manga and anime culture's timeline with more androgynous qualities. The way Nagai transitions scenes is lightning fast paced, not wasting any time other than what is needed to accurately explore the story and all its cinematic ups and downs. There is a fault to the pacing, however. Towards the end of the 5-volume story, you get a rushed, albeit highly satisfying and soul-crushing ending, but leading up to that fantastic ending, you get a half-baked rush to the finish line, which almost feels like he couldn't think of what to do up until the ending, which for me was a bit jarring. It almost felt like an entire chapter was missing. But even with that said, the ending itself was melancholic and heartbreaking, to say the least. In the beginning, you're introduced to Akira Fudo, who is your average, everyday, timid young man who just doesn't want to be bothered. When a group of bullies that later end up being allies to Akira show up to antagonize him. At that moment, it's a bit standard fare until his sociopathic friend Ryo shows up to get him out of the pickle he got himself in, and it becomes a trip to hell in every possible way. But back to the bullies, they end up becoming allies to Akira in later volumes, which I thought was a nice twist on the delinquent antagonist, since there's so much more to worry about when it comes time for their joint cooperation. You also get the female love interest, who can hold her own, and has a potty mouth, and will stand her own ground. She transitions from giving Akira flack to eventually being at his beck and call in a pretty humorous way. But the meat and potatoes, the main foundation of Devilman, is the relationship between Akira and Ryo. Their dynamic is very similar to a certain duo's relationship in a wee little manga. You may have heard of it. How is it similar to Berserk? Well, it was similar enough that it piqued my interest as a Berserk fanatic to try out Devilman. You can see many parallels that I imagine Kentaro Miura, the creator of Berserk, was influenced by. The parallels from Guts, the protagonist of Berserk, to Akira follows as so. Both suffer traumatic moments in their early life. Both deal with the betrayal of someone close to them. Both are highly capable in combat, and both have inner demons, and sometimes outer, that have to be suppressed and expressed in each given moment. I advise for anyone who's into Berserk to give Devilman a shot. I won't go into spoilers, and what I have shared so far is just mild to begin with, so it's nothing to obsess over. What kept me hooked on Devilman was how concise the dialogue is. You get enough to give you a general gist of the character's personality or opinions on the matter at hand, but there is your average exposition dump from a character, mainly Ryo, but it serves the plot and reinforces the dread the characters are feeling. There's also a bleed of mass hysteria, racism, and paranoia that the manga manages to integrate into the story really well, without being overly preachy or even having a difficult message to begin with. Other than that, humanity fucked itself, and it's dreadful. Which, well, speaking of dread, the combat is eye-catching and never outstays its welcome. But even if it's rad to look at, part of that clenched feeling in your chest is how frighteningly powerful the opposition is. The world goes to shit so insanely fast. It's very similar to a Shin Megami Tensei game and how quickly the world crumbles to its demonic/angelic origin. Akira, while merged with the demon Amon, is increasingly more powerful than he was as a human. He's more confident, he lusts for battle almost to a fault, but with that power in his veins, his DNA has changed, as well as his ability to fight. But you never feel like he's overpowered, or, as far as an original manga is concerned, you don't feel like they are limiting his power to extend the length of the fight scene. Compact, but explosive. Devilman has a lot to say, and doesn't waste a second in showing it to you. You have a general outline of the lore behind the Gnostic qualities that loom over the horizon. You learn the character's yearnings and wishes, There's even a small smorgasbord of heartbreaking moments of side characters who met their demise while you're hoping for them to get saved by the demon knight Akira. Devilman has impressed me. It manages to hold up past its time, and in such a short read, it leaves open to be expanded upon. But it also closes a chapter, ending on a moment that still has me contemplating as I edit and record this. Now we just have to hope a certain other series learns to be a bit more concise and timely, so we can get our long-awaited ending.
Ryu Asuka.
I don't give a shit.
Akira Kudo.
Fuck you!
Devilman.